This class will be recorded for anybody who is wondering. Let me just make sure that this is actually on Facebook, and then we will get started. Sylvia, do you know how this can automatically go onto the Facebook page? Because I don't have access to it. I don't know if you...
Either. The only person I know who has it is Rabbi Marsha. Adeline might have it too, but I don't have it.
I could stream it on my personal Facebook, and then it's just there in general, and then the collaborative could share it if that helps.
I don't know, and I really don't know the answer to that. We should ask Rabbi Marsha, because sometimes I just find things on Facebook that are recorded that I had no idea we actually recorded on Facebook. So I don't know if they record it, put it on the website, and then stream it to Facebook. I have no idea, but I think questions.
All right, I'll put it on my Facebook, and then we could just so it's there, and then we will figure it out from there.
Okay.
Just make sure it's there. Sorry, everyone here for all the technical talk here. I feel like every time I do a class on Zoom, I have to refigure out how to use the internet here. Okay, I think that is good. Let's get started. All right, good morning, everybody. Hope you all had a wonderful weekend. Welcome to our second class in our major trends and types of Zionist thinking. Just a quick review of the first class for those that might not have been there, and then we'll hop into today's discussion, which I am super excited about. We're going to be going through one of my favorite pieces of Jewish literature really ever, although I tend to say that about a lot of pieces of literature. So last time we discussed really the origin of Herzl's Zionistic thought, and just a 30-second review from last time. Herzl is thought to be the father of political Zionism. We discussed how Herzl wasn't actually the person to start the idea of returning to Israel. That's, of course, a multi-thousand-year-old Jewish idea. And Herzl didn't even necessarily start the trend in the 1800s of Jews moving to Israel. There was a movement called Chovevei Tzion, or the Lovers of Zion, of masses of people moving mostly from Eastern Europe to the land of Israel. But Herzl was the first person to actually start to, we might say in Hebrew, begin the tachlis of it, right? To actually start to plan for what it would mean to actually set up governmental institutions. And he was the one to convene the Zionist Congress. And we discussed a lot of the philosophy that was undergirding Herzl's thought, which can really be summarized by two things. And that's going to be important to contrast it to what we're going to discuss today. Herzl believed, right? We discussed a lot about his views on anti-Semitism, right? So Herzl was primarily motivated. And when I say primarily, we can give it a number, right? He was almost 100% motivated by anti-Semitism, right? For Herzl, no matter what Jews did, anti-Semitism was always going to be endemic and ubiquitous. Therefore, the only way to ensure the safety of Jews was through a political state where Jews can basically be in control of their own government and army and police force. And in theory, after that, Jews will live happily ever after. Herzl paid very little attention to what would happen to, let's say, Jews around the world, right? In Herzl's thinking, once Israel was founded, Jews from all over the diaspora would realize that the only way to stay safe would actually be to move to Israel. And all of the Jews would seemingly, right, I'm being a little flippant here, but live happily ever after in the new land that Herzl helped set up, right? So that is Herzl's philosophy in a nutshell. So right after Herzl convenes the first Zionist Congress, right? This is 1896 or 97. Herzl amasses, right? You can imagine dozens, if not hundreds, of the most powerful people in the Jewish world who are on board with the Zionist project. As an interesting aside, in Eastern Europe, in the late 1800s, there was the anti-Semitic forgery of the Protocols of Elders of Zion, right? This conspiratorial book that alleged that Jews had this secret plot to control the world that was responsible actually for a lot of the anti-Semitism we saw in Europe in the 1900s. This was created as a result of the First Zionist Congress, because in the mind of the anti-Semites, this was the Jews sitting around thinking about how to control the world. In reality, the First Zionist Congress was Jews sitting around trying to figure out what to do with this tiny movement on this tiny plot of land. And so Herzl convenes this Zionist Congress, and in the Zionist Congress, right, they're of course discussing a lot of the pragmatics, right? How do you go from nothingness to statehood? And there's one person that's sitting there, and I'll share my screen, and we'll start a slideshow in a minute. There's one man who is sitting there named Ahad Ha'am, who's going to become one of the most important figures of Zionism. And a lot of this is actually a picture of the First Zionist Congress. And you can imagine, right, this is the first time that all of these different leaders from across the Jewish world that are all on board with this idea of Zionism, which, by the way, is extremely ill-defined at this point, right? What does it mean to be a Zionist in the late 1800s, right? Today, we all have an intuitive idea. If I say I'm a Zionist, you might not know how religious I am, or if I liked Bibi, or if I hate Bibi, but you probably know that I'm in favor of the Jewish political entity called Israel in the Middle East continuing to exist, right? That's probably the basic definition of a Zionist today, right? In the 1800s, people had no idea what it meant. And one concrete example, which I'd imagine a lot of people here are familiar with, is that Herzl early on was actually offered Uganda to be a Jewish state. And again, think about Herzl's philosophy, and it's going to be important here when we introduce our next type of Zionism, cultural Zionism. But as a political Zionist who believed that the only reason for Zionism was to combat anti-Semitism, and Jews needed a state where Jews can be in control of government and all of that, Uganda seems like a great choice. Because if the British government can just promise the land of Uganda, of course, the British government was a colonialist entity, right? Why not accept Uganda, right? In the words of Herzl, right? Uganda might be a little bit easier, right? Again, this is still at a time when the Ottoman Empire was in control of the land of Israel. So Europe hadn't colonized the Middle East yet, right? That wouldn't take place until after World War I. And so at this point in the late 1800s, when the British government offers Uganda, and then at another point, they actually offered parts of Ethiopia to be a Jewish state, Herzl and a lot of the other political Zionists said, that sounds like a great idea, right? We can go to this land that already our co-Western Europeans have already colonized, right? They've already brought a lot of European culture into those lands in Africa, right? Herzl was very much a European, and we'll distinguish that with, and I mean that in all senses of the word, right? He wanted to import European culture to the new Jewish state, which we'll discuss and contrast that in a minute. Why not accept Uganda? And this was actually one of the things that Herzl brings to the Zionist Congress. And you could imagine the really interesting debate that takes place about, is it important for the Jewish state to actually be in the historic Jewish homeland? And to us in 2023, that sounds absolutely crazy, because the vast majority of Jews today that have any association with Zionism in Israel, I would guess and venture to say, and this is personally true for me, a huge connection between myself and Zionism is the fact that it is in the historic land of Israel. If Jews had a small state in the middle of Uganda, maybe I'd be curious enough to visit it once or twice, but it would hardly be the place that I'd spend years of my life going there and bringing students there multiple times a year and everything like that. And so you imagine the scene, right? And we have a little picture here so you can, you don't have to use so much imagination, right? And you have, right, hundreds of men, and of course they were all men, right, stuffed into this room, and they are all debating all of these questions about what is actually the goal of what we're doing, right? Everybody that gets into the room, we agree that we're Zionists. Okay, great. Now what does that mean, right? And one of the reasons why I'm starting off here today is because last time, of course, we discussed a lot of the philosophy underpinning why Herzl originally wanted to set up this, this Zionistic entity. But of course, this is when they actually gather. And I see somebody in the comments saying, can I discuss the idea of a Jewish enclave in the Soviet Union? Yeah, So this was actually a popular idea, right? The idea of a autonomous Jewish state, again, wasn't even necessarily unique to having it be in Uganda and Ethiopia. There were a whole bunch of other proposals that was given. There's actually right now in Eastern Europe, there is an autonomous Jewish state that has, I think, 10,000 Jews living in it, and it's considered its own political entity. And so these, of course, were options, and different world powers were also giving Jews different options, because at this point, a lot of these countries wanted to sort of have it both ways. And this gets into a little bit more of the geopolitics that I wanted to get into, because I really want to talk about ideas. But there was a tension here from a lot of other countries that I think is important to understand. On the one hand, countries like France and Britain and Germany, right? This is still in the late 1800s. They wanted to appear progressive. And when I say appear progressive, I mean they wanted to offer Jews equal rights. And also Jews, in a lot of these cases, especially in Western Europe, were very helpful engines of the economy, right? You can imagine a lot of Jews were, in various industries. There were a lot of Jewish scientists, a lot of Jewish doctors, right? You can imagine, right? Jews were embedded within the fabric of society. This is 100 years after emancipation. So there had been generations for Jews to get up into places where they were helpful members of the wider society. On the other hand, anti-Semitic sentiment was so high in these countries that as a political leader in Britain and France and Germany, you didn't want to appear being too cozy with Jews. So you had this tension of how do you keep Jews happy, and how do you keep the, I don't want to say the masses because it wasn't everybody, but how do you keep a population that skews towards very anti-Semitic ideas happy? So one interesting proposal that a lot of countries started thinking about was, let's just offer Jews a small piece of land within here, and then everybody will be happy. Jews might stay, the anti-Semites will be happy, right? And all will live happily ever after. Obviously, that is not how it ended up. I'm happy to talk more about that later. So, of course, at the Zionist Congress, they're debating the goals of Zionism. They're debating the location. They're also debating the language. And this is something I think we discussed a little bit at the end of last time. But if the Zionist entity, right, I'm not going to call it Israel at this point, because at this point, the political Zionists weren't all sold on the idea of it being Israel. If you are just trying to get an autonomous Jewish state, and you want this autonomous Jewish state to be primarily a Western European type Jewish state, then you don't need this country to be, you don't need the language of the country to be anything specific, right? It doesn't make a difference if it's French or English or anything like that. And so Herzl was very strong on the idea that, of course, the language of the new Jewish state should be German, because everybody knew that the intellectuals at the time were speaking German. And so, of course, the language of the new state should be German, right? Contrasted that to, of course, other thinkers in the audience who thought, no, if we're trying to create a country, there should be a national language associated with it. And perhaps it's worthwhile to try to revive the language of Hebrew, right? Again, more on that in a minute. The other question is, what is the relationship going to be with Jews in the diaspora? And this is a really interesting question. And this is still, I would argue, a tension today, 130 years later after the first Zionist Congress, between Israel and primarily American Jews. What is our relationship as American Jews with Israel? What is Israel's relationship with us? If you adopt the Herzl worldview, right, and I'll give a very specific example in a minute, this created a firestorm 8 years ago. I remember exactly where I was when this happened. There was an anti-Semitic attack against the Jewish community in France. And there was this horrific episode where a gunman came into a kosher supermarket in France. And this was after a wave of a number of anti-Semitic incidents against the Jewish community in Paris. And Paris, of course, has a long Jewish history of being anti-Semitic, both in the Middle Ages and also, sadly, in the last 20, 30 years, as anti-Semitism is on a rise in Western Europe, but specifically France has seen a lot of the brunt of it. And so after this anti-Semitic attack, you can imagine Jewish communities around the world were expressing sympathy and how can we help and, everything like that. And whatever we think about the person or the tweet, I don't want to get bogged down here, but just as an example of this type of Herzlian political Zionist thinking is Benjamin Netanyahu, then the prime minister, said in a tweet, Something like, we pray for all of the Jews of France, just so you know, Israel is your home. That is where you will be safe. And so on the one hand, there's a way to read this tweet by saying, well, isn't this great? Bibi is basically saying, Benjamin Netanyahu is saying, Israel has their back. A lot of other people took the other side and said, wait a minute, this seems like the subtext of this is Benjamin Netanyahu is saying, you're not really going to be safe until you come to Israel. Now, we can probably spend, the next 4 hours debating the merits of that statement. And that's still something that you hear a lot today, right? In a lot of conversation across the Jewish world, a conversation, right? I'm going to mimic a conversation that I feel like I've even had and overheard hundreds of times, which is one person saying, life in the diaspora or America or Canada or wherever Jews are living in relative safety is pretty good. And somebody else says, well, it's good for now, but just wait until things turn bad. And then someone else says, well, yeah, but then we'll all just move to Israel, right? And so it's a very common view of Israel. We can name that to some way the Israel as American Jewish insurance policy, right? We can imagine that as an idea that a lot of people have. And that is very central to Herzl's thinking about diasporic Jewry, right? It is only a matter of time, according to Herzl, given Herzl's views of anti-Semitism, right? Herzl thought anti-Semitism will never be cured. The only way Jews will be safe is with their own autonomous state. Therefore, once a state is set up, it's only a matter of time before everywhere else where Jews live turns anti-Semitic enough for Jews to all eventually flock to Israel. And so whether that takes 10 years or 100 years or 200 years, any Jew that's living in America today or Canada or Europe or Iran, right? There's still some Jews there. It's only a matter of time before they all end up living in the land of Israel, right? You can imagine contrasting that with another type of Zionist thought, which also exists today. And I would imagine and argue a lot of American Jews adopt, which is to say, I'm very happy Israel exists. Israel is important, right? For a number of reasons, safety is one of them, but Israel is also preserving something about Jewish heritage that's more than just physical safety. And perhaps the reason why American Jews, right, I'm using American Jews as a stand-in for diaspora, because in 2023, when we talk about diaspora, right, about 45% of Jews in the world live in America, about 50 or 51% of Jews in the world live in Israel, and the other 4 or 5% are scattered around. But really today, there are 2 Jewish centers, America and Israel, right? A certain type of American Jewish thinking that says, you know what, I might never move to Israel, but I'm very happy it exists, not because of an insurance policy, but because Israel is a place of inspiration, right? Israel is a place of rich Jewish history and culture and studying. And so while I might never, right, I'm imagining a hypothetical person saying this, while I might never move to Israel, I still want to take annual or biannual visits there, and I want to study the culture and the language and the history of a lot of what Israel has to offer. That's a very different view of Israel than Israel as political insurance policy in case everything goes wrong. And then the last debate that they had, and this we'll probably get into a little bit more next week, and so hold our thinking on this for now, is relationship with the local population. And by local population, I mean the Arabs that were there at the time, right? Herzl had a view, right, with his sort of Western European mindset, where at that time, right, just important to understand historically, the idea of colonialism was not a negative term. It was actually used positively by a lot of thinkers in Europe in the late 1800s. Herzl's view, as delineated, we discussed last time, his book, Alt New Land, or Old New Land, right, the inspiration for Tel Aviv. He imagined that once material conditions were lifted up for everybody, right? Herzl also had a little bit of socialistic tendencies. Once the Zionists hit the ground, and once they drain the swamps, and once they set up modern hospitals, and once they build train stations all throughout the land of Israel, then of course the local population who will see their life expectancy go up, they'll see their bank accounts go up, they'll be able to get better treatment, they'll be able to travel around more, right? They'll be really ushered into modernity. Of course they're going to love us, right? That was Herzl's view, right? It's a view based in very almost materialistic type thinking. Ahad Ha'am wasn't so sure, right? Ahad Ha'am wrote a lot about, and I'll introduce Ahad Ha'am in a second, right? But there were other elements of the Zionist Congress that were saying we should actually probably have a plan. And when I say plan, right, any definition of that word falls under this other category, right? A plan could either be we have to be much more aggressive towards the local population. We'll discuss this next week. Or we have to be much less aggressive and much more, right, concerned with, right, being very careful and creating relationships and making sure not to create a 120-year war with the local population. And this is something that we should worry about, and materialistic benefits for everybody is not going to automatically make everybody their levels. So these were a lot of the debates, right? I'm just painting the picture here because, again, one of the main reasons that, or one of the main goals that I have for this 4-part series is to really complicate what it even means to be a Zionist and to say that somebody's a Zionist, or just to think about Zionism big picture, right? They had this convention, and there was no time in the history of Zionism or Israel, and we can include Judaism in that list too, where everybody was in unanimous agreement, or there was even 51% agreement on all of the different ideas of what you might want that entity to look like. And so enter Achad Ha'am, and Achad Ha'am, just to introduce him a little bit. So his real name is Asher Ginsburg, right? Achad Ha'am in Hebrew is taken from a verse in the Tanakh, and it just means one of the nation. And so to some extent, Achad Ha'am tried to position himself as sort of the layman, right, to some extent, right? While Herzl and the political Zionists were oftentimes the elite in society, Achad Ha'am, right, quite literally one of the nation, tries to position himself by speaking on behalf of the average Jew who might not have their head steeped in philosophy and geopolitics, right? What might the average Jew think about Zionism? And just a couple of interesting things about Achad Ha'am to really understand his philosophy. Most of the political Zionists, right? This was, again, 100 years after the emancipation and the Enlightenment happened. And so there were tons of Jews who at this point had been secular for 2 or 3 generations. And so in the time of Herzl, the idea of a secular Jew, right, it was just as common to some extent as it is today, right? Today, none of us would bat an eye if a Jew says, I'm Jewish and atheist, right? We say, okay, of course, right? You still have, still come to synagogue on Shabbat, right? We want you as a part of the community, right? So that was very true in the late 1800s as well. And so most of the political Zionists, right, a lot of them came from mostly secular backgrounds. And, right, you can contrast this with, right, or compare this to Herzl to some extent. Herzl grew up as an assimilationist, right? Herzl, if it wasn't for anti-Semitism, right, just to get back to Herzl's worldview for a moment, if it wasn't for anti-Semitism, Herzl would have been more than happy living the rest of his life in Western Europe as a completely assimilated, right, European, and completely thrust off all echoes of Jewish identity, right? That was Herzl's view. Asher Ginsburg, or Achad Ha'am, grew up, you can imagine, on the opposite side of the Jewish world. He grew up to a deeply Hasidic family. And just like today, the Hasidic world was typified by being very separated from the rest of the world in general, right? The sort of stereotype about the Hasidic world is that while the ghetto walls were coming down because different states and countries were allowing Jews to interact with society, the leaders of the Hasidic movement were trying to repatch the walls just as fast as the government was trying to tear them down, right? So Hasidic Judaism, to some extent, wanted to continue the sort of ghetto lifestyle that Jews were forced into in the 1600s and 1700s, right? Hasidic leaders wanted to keep Judaism very insular. And so he grows up in that environment. He goes to Cheder, which is a very traditional Jewish school, and his parents' hopes for him is that he would become a nice Hasidic rabbi. And of course, he goes off, and early on in his yeshiva studies, he starts coming across a lot of Haskalah ideas, right? Jewish Enlightenment ideas. And he goes through a major pivot of thinking where he stops being Hasidic and stops identifying himself with the Orthodox movement, but still for the rest of his life, right, he would maintain a deep attachment to Judaism, which is going to be extremely important in a second, because I'm going to share his essay, and hopefully we will see some excerpts there. Before we go there, just to paint the scene a little bit more, So Herzl puts together the Zionist Congress, right? We've discussed Herzl's idea, and Asher Ginsburg there is sitting there, and he was the only person in this Zionist Congress that, while everybody else was, rumptuous applause and cheering and saying this is the best thing ever, right? Let's go, rah rah. Asher Ginsburg, or Ahad Ha'am, was sitting there, and he got up and gave a speech where he heavily critiqued the political Zionist agenda. And we'll discuss what that means in a minute, but he definitely made himself very few friends at this first Zionist Congress. And here is a little bit of what happened. And I'll just say, I went through his famous essay trying to find good excerpts for this. I was telling Maddie before. And the problem is when somebody's a good writer, they usually don't put a lot of extraneous material in their writing. And so it was very difficult going through his essay, right? This is probably one of the most famous essays in Jewish history. It was very hard going through Ahad Ha'am's essay and actually trying to figure out what pieces make sense to put and what pieces don't. So I apologize if this is a little bit too much material, but especially given that this is an advanced learning institute here, I think we really could go through a lot of the text here, and hopefully we'll never see the debates within Zionism in Israel the same way. And so I think it really is worth it to devote 15, 20 minutes to dissecting this text, and then we can have a conversation about it after. So Ahad Ha'am writes as follows. He says, some months have passed since the Zionist Congress, but its echoes are still heard in daily life and in the press. In daily life, the echoes take the form of meetings, small and big, local and central. Since the delegates returned home, they have been gathering the public together and recounting over and over again the wonders that they saw enacted before their eyes. The wretched, hungry public listens and waxes enthusiastic and hopes for salvations. For can they, the Jews of the West, fail to carry out anything they plan? Right, so he's of course being very pedantic here when describing, right, all of the political Zionists, right? They have these grand ideas and everybody's excited about them. In the press, all of these meetings with their addresses, motions, and resolutions appear over and over again in the guise of articles written in a vein of enthusiasm and triumph. The meeting was magnificent. Every speaker was a Demosthenes, who was a great Greek orator. The resolutions were carried by acclamation. All those present were swept off their feet and shouted with one voice, "We will do and obey," right? And this is a great reference here because this is, of course, a reference to the biblical book of Exodus, where Moses brings down the Torah, and before hearing what is in it, the Israelites in the desert say, "Na'aseh v'nishma," we will do and we will obey, which in traditional Jewish literature, this is supposed to be this great statement of praise for the Jewish people that even before they were able to learn what's in the 10 Commandments and the Torah, they accepted it. Here, he's of course being extremely critical towards the Zionist movement because he's saying everybody's just signing on to this, right? Or everybody in the Zionistic world is signing on to this. They have no idea what's in it. So he says, in a word, everything was delightful, entrancing, perfect. And the Congress itself still produces a literature of its own. Pamphlets specifically devoted to its praises appear in several languages. Jewish and non-Jewish papers still occasionally publish articles and notes about it. And needless to say, the Zionist organ, right, Herzl's newspaper, itself endeavors to maintain the impression which the Congress made and not to allow it to fade too rapidly from the public memory. It searches the press of every nation and every land, and wherever it finds a favorable mention of the Congress, even in some insignificant journal published in the language of one of the smaller European nationalities, it immediately gives a summary of the article with much jubilation. Only one small nation's language has thus not been honored with such attention, though its journals too have lavish praise on the Congress. I mean Hebrew, right? So this is his setup for his essay, and he's describing a scene where you have the political Zionists, and they are, of course, having this meeting. And to some extent, he's describing a situation of, you imagine a self-congratulatory circle where all of the Western Zionists, and you'll see why I keep using the term Western Zionist, because one of the things that Ahad Ha'am sets up is a dichotomy between what he calls the Zionists, or even the Western Zionists, and the Eastern Zionists, or the Chovevei Tzion Zionists. And we'll see that distinction in a few minutes. But he's basically pointing out a chief irony that he's going to go back to, and an irony that I actually think to some extent still functions today in Israel and Zionism. And we can, of course, if anybody has questions or comments on this point I'm about to make, please feel free to interrupt me. The irony that he's making can be summed up as follows. The project of political Zionism in Herzl was based off of an understanding that anti-Semitism cannot be cured, and therefore Jews need to be in charge of themselves, right? That much we know, right? But he's pointing out there's an irony that Herzl and the political Zionists seem to care a lot more about what the wider world thinks than they do about what Jews think, right? And to imagine this cartoonish scene where Herzl is on the one hand saying, non-Jews, right, excuse my flippant term, right, he even uses the term, right, the goyim, right, the rest of the world.
I think we've lost Daniel. Oh, you're back. Daniel.
Yeah, I got so excited that I got my internet to be cut out. So Herzl, right? Herzl on the one hand cares an enormous amount about what the wider non-Jewish world has to say about Jews. And so there's an irony that gets to the heart of political Zionism, which is you got to pick one, right? Are you giving up on the wider world? Are you saying that the world is inherently so anti-Semitic and so unsafe to Jews that Jews have no choice but to form a little state? But it seems like every time in some German or French or British article, they speak positively about Zionists, this is seen as the ultimate proof of Zionism's success. And so Ahad Ha'am comes up with, right, again, this early critique. And so he writes as follows. In short, the universal note is one of rejoicing, and therefore it is a little small wonder that in the midst of this general harmony, my little note on the Congress sounded discordance and aroused the most violent displeasures in many quarters. I knew from the start that I should not be forgiven for saying such things at a time, and I had steeled myself to hear with equanimity the clatter of high-sounding praises and obscure innuendos of which our writers are so prolific, and hold my peace. So he's describing this internal condition that's happening in his own head of he's sitting there, he's hearing all of these things happening, and he's thinking, right, anybody who's ever been at a meeting where they disagree with everybody else in the meeting, right, you're thinking to yourself, is it worthwhile to express the fact that I completely disagree with everybody? And he decides, of course, to do it. And so he comes up actually where we left off last week, because we spoke a lot last week about Max Nordau and his views for creating the new Jew. And so he writes as follows. He says, Nordau's address on the general conditions of the Jews was sort of introduction to the business of the Congress. It exposed in incisive languages the sore troubles, material or moral, which beset the Jews the world over. In Eastern countries, their trouble is material. They have a constant struggle to satisfy the most elementary physical needs, to win a crust of bread and a breath of air, things that are which are denied because they are Jews. In the West, in the lands of emancipation, their material condition is not particularly bad, but the moral trouble is serious. They want to take full advantages of their rights and cannot. They long to become attached to the people of the country and to take part in its social life, and they are kept at arm's length. They strive after love and brotherhood and are met by looks of hatred and contempt on all sides. Conscious that they are not inferior to their neighbors in any kind of ability or virtue, they have it continually thrown in their teeth that they are an inferior type and are not fit to rise to the same level as the Aryans, and more to the same effect. Well, what then, right? And I'll explain this in a second. Nordau himself did not touch on this question. It was outside the scope of his address, but the whole Congress was the answer. Beginning as it did with Nordau's address, the Congress meant this, that in order to escape from all these troubles, it is necessary to establish a Jewish state. So what Ahad Ha'am points out, and he's the first Zionist thinker to point this out, is he's saying there's actually, if you look into what was happening historically, right, and this is something that once he says this becomes quite intuitive, but it seems like nobody else was thinking too deeply about this, there's actually more than one condition which Jews, and when I'm saying Jews, right, he's really talking about Ashkenazi Jews, right? Because he's talking about European Jews, right? We can discuss in a future session about what was going on in the non-Ashkenazi world at this point. There's actually two different things that are happening. There's the Jews that are living in Eastern Europe, right? And Eastern Europe, this is at a time before Jews had any type of equality under the law. And so this is at a time still of immense anti-Semitism, either populated by the state or by bottom up. But in Eastern Europe in the late 1800s, there was still frequent pogroms. And this was at a time, right, just like in the medieval ages, where there was no guaranteed safety at all for the Jews, right? And he contrasts that with what was going on in Western Europe, where he says, Western Europe's actually a little bit different. Again, this is 50 years before the Holocaust, and we're 40 years before the Holocaust, right? So he's not thinking about that now, which is actually one of the big contemporary critiques of Echad Ha'am, by the way, is Echad Ha'am he wasn't worried enough about anti-Semitism, right? That's probably the biggest historical critique of what we're about to read today. So you can keep that in the back of your mind. But Echad Ha'am writes, right, in the West, right, there's a very different problem that's happening, right? The problem isn't that Jews are in physical danger. The problem are that Jews are trying to be accepted socially as equal members of society, but yet there's still a tinge of, right, maybe we won't even call it anti-Semitism, just people see Jews as different, as an other. And so Jews are never going to rise at the same level as the sort of quote unquote real Europeans, right, the Aryans. And he says, well, I'd imagine, right, his well, what then, right, so he's thinking, well, I'd imagine that this first Zionist Congress, for everybody to spend a lot of time trying to solve this dichotomy and try to figure out, okay, we have two different problems here. We have the problem of the safety for Jews that were living in Eastern Europe, right? You can imagine Russia and the surrounding areas. And in Western Europe, the problem seems to be a lot more social, and he'll end up saying actually spiritual in a little bit later. And so he goes on, right, in the middle of his essay, right? Again, we couldn't read the whole essay, to point out all of the problems with, right, the pragmatic problems, right, with setting up a Jewish state. And it can be summed up by basically saying the path from nothingness to statehood is going to be a lot longer than Herzl or any of the other political Zionists want to admit, right? And this is something that actually did turn out to be historically true, right? It took 50 plus years from the first Zionist Congress until there was actually a state of Israel. And one of the things that Echad Ha'am was correct about was, if Zionism is only about improving the materialistic life, right, and safety for Jews worldwide, right, you have a problem, because it's going to take a very long time for this to actually be fulfilled, right? And so Echad Ha'am starts to say, well, there has to be another component that we're working towards here, right? What are we going to do in the meantime, right? Is this going to be a 50-year, right? Again, no one was able to predict how long this would take, but Echad Ha'am starts asking the question that had never really been asked before, which is Zionism just about physical safety for Jews, right? Or might there be something else that we're trying to gain out of Zionism and out of Israel? And so he continues and he says as follows, right? I'm just going to check the chat to see if there are questions. Somebody asked if by East he means Mizrahi. No, by East he means the Jews that are living in Eastern Europe, right? That are typically just, again, this is a historical stereotype, but it's historically true that the Jews that were living more Eastern were more traditional and more religious, right? Because they weren't living in lands that were emancipated, right? So you can imagine your average Western European Jew in the late 1800s was much more secular, right? A lot of them were socialists. A lot of them were nationalists of whatever country they were in. They were a lot less religious, right? In a traditional sense. In Eastern Europe, the vast majority of the community was still very religious, very Hasidic, right? And all of that. So Echad Ha'am writes as follows. He says, truth is bitter, but with all its bitterness, it is better than illusion. We must confess to ourselves that the ingathering of the exiles is unattainable by natural means. So he's saying this idea that Herzl has, that you're going to set up a state and Jews all around the world are going to run to it, is an illusion. We may by natural means establish a Jewish state one day, and the Jews may increase and multiply in it until the country will hold no more. But even then, the greater part of the people will remain scattered in strange lands. To gather our scattered ones from the four corners of the earth is impossible. Only religion with its belief in a miraculous redemption can promise that consummation. But if this is so, if the Jewish state too means not an ingathering of exiles, but the settlement of a small part of our people in Palestine, then how will it solve the material problem of the Jewish masses in the lands of the diaspora? So he points out another problem, right? He says it's going to take a very long time, right, if ever, for Jews in large numbers to actually move here, right? This is something that in some ways was very true, right? In the first 20 or 30 years of Zionism, very, very few Jews actually moved to Palestine, right? Post-Holocaust, it turns out not to be true, right? When, obviously there was a huge immigration of Jews to Palestine. But he says, if the whole point of Herzl Zionism, right, just to follow the logic here, if the whole point of Herzl Zionism is to cure anti-Semitism, and even if we establish the state, the majority of Jews are still going to live in the diaspora, how does that help anything, right? How does it help an American Jew, or to use what I started off for, the Jews in France, how does it help them when there's an anti-Semitic attack? The fact that they know that there's an autonomous Jewish country a couple thousand miles away, right? So he's laying that question down, and then he tackles one possible answer. He says, do the champions of the state think, perhaps, that being masters in our own country, we shall be able by diplomatic means to get the various governments to relieve the material suffering of our scattered fellow Jews? And so he says, well, perhaps the idea of Zionism is that because Israel is very strong and powerful, Jews all over the diaspora will feel safer because Israel can intercede on their behalf, right? We can debate, again, the merits of whether or not this is true or not, but he says that, it seems to me, is Dr. Herzl's latest theory. In his new pamphlet, we no longer find any calculation of the number of years it'll take for Jews to enter their country. Instead, he tells us in so many words that even if the land becomes the national property of the Jewish people, even though no individual Jew privately owns a single yard of it, then the Jewish problem will be solved forever. These words can be understood only in the way suggested above, but this hope seems to me so fantastic that I need not waste words in demolishing it. Right? So Echad Ha'am is not entertained by this idea, right? He's saying any way you slice it, Zionism as a way to cure anti-Semitism makes no sense, right? He says for all of these reasons. He says, one, Zionists and Israel, right? I'm blending the ancient and modern. Israel is always going to care about what the international community thinks, right? You're always going to be scouring the newspapers. You're always going to be tuning into the UN and EU sessions and seeing what are people saying about Israel. We're always going to be happy when pop artists from, America and Europe come and perform in Tel Aviv. We're always going to be upset when artists from Europe and America boycott Israel, right, as a part of BDS, right? That's how he opens up. And he's saying even the materialistic concerns, right, Jewish safety is not going to be cured in the rest of the world just because there is a Jewish state, right? If there's anti-Semitism on a local level anywhere in the world, right, Israel is not going to solve that. And so he's also tackling sort of an implicit question here, which, again, there's a lot of these ideas to like and a lot of these ideas to reject. And so, right, Echad Ha'am ends up being one of the most interesting thinkers of Zionism. And one of the reasons why I'm really, this isn't my, normally I don't just throw up an entire essay and share my screen and read through it, but I think this is enormously helpful in understanding, right, the tensions in Zionism and also in modern day Israel. And so Echad Ha'am is dealing with the implicit question of how can we actually get diasporic Jews to sign on to this project as well, right? This is at a time, right, late 1800s, where already there was mass immigration of Jews from Europe to America. And you had, a generation or two generations of Jews already starting off their new life in America, right? The 1880s was the huge Ashkenazi immigration. And so how can we get American Jews to actually want to support this land of Israel, short of telling them, well, hey, Sylvia, if something bad happens, you're really going to need us, right? That might not be the best sales pitch to try to get American Jewish support or to try to get donations, or at least Echad Ha'am thought. So he concludes the section by saying the material problem then will not be ended by the foundation of the Jewish state, nor generally speaking, does it lie in our power to end it. And whether we found a state or not, this particular problem will always turn at the bottom of the economic condition of each country and the degree of civilization attained by each people. And so he he gives one more blow to political Zionism, which is a very simple one. Herzl, to some extent, right? And this is ironic because Herzl was secular, but he accuses Herzl of messianic or religious thinking. He says Herzl thinks he's going to make a state. Jews all over the world, they're going to miraculously show up there, and then anti-Semitism will be cured. Ahad Ha'am says there's another paradox there, right? If Zionism is built on the belief that anti-Semitism is incurable, just because we get all the Jews to a small state in the Middle East doesn't mean the rest of the world is going to wake up and be like, all right, I guess there's no more reason to be anti-Semitic. And so he says, if Zionism is only there to cure anti-Semitism, right, there's another tension there within Zionism. And so here is what he concludes. He says, thus, we are driven to the conclusion that the only true basis of Zionism is to be found in the other problem, the moral one. And now he introduces an entirely different ideology of Zionism that becomes known as cultural Zionism, right? So this is now the first type of Zionism to branch off of the political Zionism, which is why I just thought it's important to read all this. So the next time somebody says cultural Zionism, right, we have some idea of where this comes from. So he says, the Western Jew, after leaving the ghetto and seeking to attach himself to the people of the country in which he lives, is unhappy because his hopes of an open-armed welcome is disappointed. He returns reluctantly to his own people and tries to find within the Jewish community that life for which he yearns, but in vain, right? So Jews have a problem, right? Jews outside of Israel, right? We've gone through the Enlightenment, right? We're all, in some extent, right? We're all modern, right? And so therefore we try to assimilate into wider society. We realize that there's something blocking Jews from fully assimilating into society. And then we try to return to Jewish community, and communal life and communal problems no longer satisfies him, right? We realize that Jewish life, to some extent, in the diaspora, is not the most exciting thing we've ever seen in our lives, right? And Ahad Ha'am was very critical of, to some extent, diasporic Jewish life, not the fact that Jews live in the diaspora, but he was very critical of the life of Jews in the diaspora, and we'll tackle this a little bit later. But he says he has already grown accustomed to a broader social life and political life, and the intellectual side of Jewish cultural work has no attraction, because Jewish culture has played no part in his education from childhood and is a closed book to him. So in his trouble, he turns to the land of his ancestors and pictures to himself how good it would be if a Jewish state were reestablished there, a state arranged and organized exactly after the pattern of other states. Then he can live a full, complete life among his own people and find at home all that he now sees outside, dangled before his eyes, but out of reach. Of course, not all the Jews will be able to take wing and go to their state, but the very existence of the Jewish state will raise the prestige of those who remain in exile, and their fellow citizens will no more despise them and keep them at arm's length, although they were ignoble slaves dependent entirely on the hospitality of others. As he contemplates this fascinating vision, it suddenly dawns on his inner consciousness that even now, before the Jewish state is established, the mere idea of it gives him almost complete relief. He has an opportunity for organized work, for political excitement. He finds a suitable field of activity without having to become subservient to non-Jews. And he feels that thanks to this ideal, he stands once more spiritually erect and has regained human dignity without overmuch trouble and without external aid. So he devotes himself to the ideal with all the ardor of which he is capable. He gives rein to his fantasy. He lets it soar as its will up above reality and the limitations of human power. For it is not the attainment of the ideal that he needs, its pursuit alone is sufficient to cure him of his moral sickness, which is a consciousness of inferiority, and the higher and the more distant the ideal, the greater its power of exaltation, right? This is an extremely powerful paragraph. Just to summarize this and tease out the ideology, he's saying Jewish life in the diaspora is weak. Most Jews have already become assimilated, and therefore the day-to-day I'll use the term banality of Jewish life doesn't really excite them, right? And to some extent, this is a critique that could be applied today, right? What percentage of American Jews are showing up to davening on Shabbat morning, right? I don't actually have the numbers, but I would probably guess it's under 10%, maybe even much lower, right? When you consider the entire American Jewish community. And he's saying, right, there's no creative outlet to some extent, right? What do you do with Jews right at this time in Western Europe in the late 1800s when they're too assimilated, or for whatever reason, they're not involving themselves in Jewish religious life? And yet when they try to assimilate, they're either not let in because of some perceived otherness, or maybe they're even not let in because just socially and spiritually, right, to use Achad Ha'am's terms, they don't mesh with the wider population. And so you have this paradox of Jews in modernity, where they're too assimilated to interact with Jewish tradition, and they're too Jewish to interact with wider society. And so he says Jews are stuck to some extent. And so he says, well, what if, right, we have this ideal of a Jewish center, right? He doesn't even use the term state necessarily because he didn't think this required a state to be achieved, right? You have this Jewish center, and that Jewish center, you can solve the problem. Because if the problem are Jews are too assimilated for Jewish life, but too Jewish for wider society, if you created a wider society that was Jewish, right, Jews, of course, would be accepted there. And also that would require the creative faculties to actually set up a society. And so no longer are Jews in the diaspora spending their time dealing with questions that no longer excite them, right, of course, I'm using generalities, but no longer are Jews in the diaspora going to have a choice between, do I show up to the local synagogue or do I not, right? And that being the only Jewish question. And most of them saying no, because a lot of the ideas are too archaic to them and whatever. Jews now have this entire culture that they now need to set up. Jews now need to think, just like all other peoples in the world, well, what type of government do we want to set up? What type of tax system? What type of language? What type of natural culture, right? Do we want to have, right, national art shows? Do we want to, right? All of these questions will necessarily cause a influx of Jewish creativity. And the genius of what Achad Ha'am says is it doesn't even require that you move to Palestine or to Israel, because Jews in America now can sit around and think about Judaism in a way that's not a primarily a religious identity. Judaism becomes, through Zionism, according to Achad Ha'am, a culture. And once Judaism is a culture, it doesn't matter how assimilated you are. It doesn't matter what you believe about prayer or about God or any of these things, right? You are a part of this excitement and a part of this building project. And it will reignite the fire to some extent in diasporic Jewry, just the idea of having this Jewish center that now requires all of the creative faculties of the rest of the world in order to set up. So this is Achad Ha'am's view, just to read a little bit more. So he goes and he says, this is the basis of Western Zionism, right? So here he creates this dichotomy. I'm just going to summarize or go a little bit to the end, right? And this is the sort of most quoted line of Achad Ha'am. So just, now that we have this introduction, right? So he says, it's not only Jews who have come out of the ghetto, Judaism has come out too, right? And so, right, he again builds his famous distinction between, he separates Jews and Judaism, right? And he is one of the first modern Jewish thinkers to do this. And this is a distinction that I think is enormously helpful today, that Jews and Judaism are not always the same thing, right? Judaism, by and large, is a religious tradition, obviously one that includes cultural and nationalistic and other elements, but Judaism is, by and large, a religious tradition, and Jews are an ethnic people. And so you cannot, right, in Achad Ha'am's words, right, again, today we might use a little bit different language, you can't assume that all Jews are Jewish, or you can't assume that all Jews are practicing Judaism. It's just not true. Somebody can be a Jew and they can have nothing to do with Judaism, right? And so he separates out these two things. And he says, political Zionism is only focused on Jews, right? Herzl's only interest is how do we ensure that the ethnic people called the Jews are safe, right? He doesn't care about anything else. But he says Judaism has also come out of the ghetto. He says Herzl and the political Zionists have forgotten about Judaism, right? And if Israel forgets about Judaism, that would be terrible. So he says, for Jews, the exodus is confined to certain countries and is due to toleration. But Judaism has come out of its own accord whenever it comes into contact with modern culture. This contact with modern culture overturns the defenses of Judaism from within, so that Judaism can no longer remain isolated and live a life apart. The spirit of our people strives for development. It wants to absorb those elements of general culture, which reach it from the outside to digest them and to make them a part of itself, as it has done before different periods of history. But the conditions of its life in exile are not suitable. In our time, culture wears in each country the garb of the national spirit, and the stranger who would woo her must sink his individuality and become absorbed in the dominant spirit. For this reason, Judaism in exile cannot develop its individuality in its own way. When it leaves the ghetto walls, it is in danger of losing its essential being, or at best, its national unity. It is in danger of being split up into as many kinds of Judaism, each with a different character and life, as there are countries of the Jewish dispersion, right? Just to take his last line, right? So he describes this process then, and this will be the last thing I actually read from him because I want to have some time for discussion in the last couple of minutes. He says, right, Judaism in the diaspora is going to be split into all of these different groups, right? This is, of course, at a time when the Reform and conservative and Orthodox movements were growing and spreading, and Jews were just getting into America and setting up all these different Jewish communities that were not unified, right? You had Jews in one country that had nothing to do with Jews in another country, and Reform and conservative and Orthodox and Hasidic, and it just seemed like to a Chad Ha'am that the Jewish world was becoming increasingly scattered and disunified. And so he discusses Zionism, right, not just as a creative outlet, but as a way to reunify the Jewish people, not because everybody agrees, but because everybody, to some extent, is co-partners in this project of having to build something external, right? So it's no longer focused on what can we do to bolster the Jewish community here in Orange County, and oh, if you're part of the Reform movement in Orange County, then of course you have nothing to do with the Orthodox movement in Orange County, and that has nothing to do with the secular humanistic Jews of Orange County, which has nothing to do with those couple of Jews that are completely assimilated and want nothing to do with Jewish life. Ahad Ha'am was witnessing this happening in Western Europe, and he's saying enough, right? There has to be something that connects all of these different types of Jews. And even if all of these different types of Jews are going to remain in Orange County, imagine if there's one project that everybody is unified in building, which is Israel and Zionism, which historically has turned out to be very true, right? I mean, we could talk a lot about how now Israel is oftentimes a disunifying factor among American Jews, but for about 100 years, Zionism was the main unifying factor among Jews in the diaspora. Meaning, if you go to any Jewish community in 1970, 1950, at any previous point, and you can ask questions of Jewish practice, Jewish theology, politics, right? You would have fierce disagreement, right? You'd have capitalists and socialists, you'd have atheists and Hasids, right? Everything in the middle. The one thing that would, to some extent, be a unifying factor, or so Ahad Ha'am believed among all diasporic Jews, is that this is an important project. And so even if we don't agree on the end result of this project, at least if you set up a JNF dinner, right, a Jewish National Fund dinner, you can get an Orthodox Jew sitting next to a Reform Jew, sitting next to a assimilated Jew, and that will give them inspiration. And so he includes by saying, I want to establish a state which will be a Jewish state and not merely a state of the Jews. And so this is the best way to summarize Ahad Ha'am's thinking. And so just to finish this, I never actually know if we go till 11 or 10:30, so I'll keep going because I have the next half hour off anyway. If people do have to go, feel free, but just to conclude for a few minutes, right? So Ahad Ha'am sets in this framework through this essay. And again, this is one of the most important essays, in my opinion, of Jewish history because of how much he predicted and really his prophetic spirit. But Ahad Ha'am goes on to describe how focusing just on the material and just on the pragmatic and just on the political aspects of Israel is a mistake. One, because it's never pragmatically going to work. And two, because it's completely ignoring something that Jews also need, which is a national culture and a national religion and national spirituality. And so through this lens, you can understand, right, when Herzl and the political Zionists in the late 1800s are offering up Uganda as a place for the Jewish state and are writing pamphlets about how the language in Palestine, right, free land of Israel, should be German, right? Ahad Ha'am and his followers, right, are bashing that. And they're saying, right, this was one of the biggest debates in the Jewish world in the early 1900s between the political Zionists and the cultural Zionists. The cultural Zionists were writing back and saying, you're crazy if you think that Zionism is going to work by colonizing Uganda. And you're crazy if you think that Zionism is going to work by importing a European language. We have to do this all ourselves. right? If we're going to create a national culture, there also has to be a language. And so Achad Ha'am's, right, chief partner or his student, Eliezer ben Yehuda, right? I mentioned him last week. Eliezer ben Yehuda goes and he revives the Hebrew language, right? A language that had only been, prayed in Sidurim and read about in the Tanakh and the Mishnah, right? Rabbinic works. Eliezer ben Yehuda goes and he revives this language that had never been spoken on the streets in 1700 years. And there's actually some crazy anecdotes about Eliezer ben Yehuda, where he raises his children with their first and only language being Hebrew. And at the time, they were the only people in the world that spoke Hebrew, right? So you can imagine, right? I'm sure they had a bit of a traumatic upbringing to some extent. But this was the project that cultural Zionists were bringing to the table. And just one interesting and fascinating metaphor that Achad Ha'am uses, and this is the last thing I'll say, and then I would love to have a little bit of discussion in the last 20 minutes, assuming we actually do end at 11, is Achad Ha'am uses this metaphor from rabbinic literature. And it's one of the most powerful metaphors that I think we have in Judaism. And it comes from a historical story that's really part history, part myth, which if we imagine, right, in the year 70 CE, when the temple was destroyed, right? So just, going back 2000 years in history, the Roman Empire is surrounding Jerusalem and they're about to destroy Jerusalem. A rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was one of the rabbinic leaders, is able to sneak out under the walls, and he's able to go past the Roman army, and he's able to have a conversation with Vespasian, right, the general of the Roman Empire, right? And of course, this is now where the myth comes, because probably there was never a conversation between a rabbi and the Roman general, but the rabbi and the Roman general are talking, right? And the rabbi is, clearly coming across, right? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is clearly coming across as very wise. And so, right, in classic myth form, the general says, you know what, I'm going to grant you a wish, right? And so you might imagine at this point in Jewish history, what do you wish for if you're Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? You wish that the Romans ended the siege. You wish that, you can get food into Jerusalem because it was a huge famine, right? You wish all of these things, right? What Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, right? Some of the most famous words in Jewish history, give me Yavna and its sages, right? Yavna was a tiny town in the land of Israel that was the beginning of the rabbinic movement. And you had a couple of dozen young men studying books in the land of Yavna, producing a form of literature that wouldn't actually be crystallized for 2-3 generations, the Mishnah. And a bunch of rabbis that, again, were, probably to some extent elite, right, separate from the rest of society, spending their days studying books, right? And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asks the Roman Empire, forget Jerusalem, right, to some extent, right? Forget the siege, forget all of these things that are happening. Save Yavna, right? Ensure that this tiny area will be saved. And within the Talmud, by the way, the next line in the Talmud is, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's colleagues heard this, they derided him, they called him a fool, all these things. And they said, why did you not ask for Vespasian to preserve Jerusalem? And the story sort of ends there, right? You can speculate, maybe Yochanan ben Zakkai thought that there's no way that the Roman Empire would actually pull back from Jerusalem. Maybe he thought Jerusalem was already going to be destroyed. But Achad Ha'am reads this a completely different way. What Achad Ha'am says about this story is, if Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai only asked the Roman Empire and the Roman army to save Jerusalem, great, he would be saving Jews, but Judaism wouldn't be saved, right? Judaism, to some extent, was only going to be preserved by these sages in Yavna, right? That was the future of Judaism. And so to some extent, right, according to this reading, Yochanan ben Zakkai was willing to sacrifice the safety in the short term of Jews, right? I'm reading it in the most critical version, but I think it's interesting to tease out these ideas. He was willing to sacrifice the physical safety of Jews in order to preserve Judaism. And historically, right, this is in rabbinic mythology, so the story is probably not written down for hundreds of years later. The story turns out to be, of course, a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it is Yavna and the Mishnah and the legacy of the Talmud that has allowed Judaism to survive over the last 2,000 years. And so what Achad Ha'am says is that Herzl is still worried about Jerusalem and the siege. And that's not the problem, right? That's a very short-term thinking solution for the future of Judaism. And that if it's just about the physical safety of Jews, right, we've already lost the battle. Because one, Ahad Ha'am was skeptical of the project of political Zionism being able to provide that safety. And he also thought that that wasn't the only problem worth thinking about, right? Ahad Ha'am wanted to preserve Judaism in the modern world, right? How do you create a Judaism that is relevant and captivating to modern Jews when many of us, right, I'm using us, right, the, capital U, right, us in the diaspora are no longer as religious as our great-great-grandparents, are no longer as fluent in Jewish tradition, are no longer driven to communal Jewish life in the same way. For Ahad Ha'am, that problem is solved by Zionism. And so he uses what he is doing as an analogy, or uses Yavne as an analogy for what he's doing. And he says, we're going to set up a small cultural center. It doesn't even matter if the masses flock here. And we're going to create a new type of way of seeing Judaism, a type of Judaism where Israel and Zionism provide a cultural center. And by the way, just this will be actually the last thing I say, because I know I've said that 4 different times already, and then I would love to hear some thoughts. It is Ahad Ha'am's thinking, and he describes Judaism as a culture, right? This is the first time, to the best of my knowledge in Jewish history, that Judaism is described as a culture, right? Herzl wanted to describe Judaism as a nation. Ahad Ha'am describes Judaism as a culture. And it is Ahad Ha'am that ends up inspiring his writing, especially this essay, was one of the biggest influences of a young rabbi in America a generation later named Mordechai Kaplan. And we might say, well, who's Mordechai Kaplan? Why do I care about him? Mordechai Kaplan was the American Jewish leader who also wrote a lot about how Judaism was, right? He defined Judaism as a civilization. And he said in America, he said, you know what would be really great to have in America? It seems like the majority of Jews, right, all the same problems of the Ahad Ha'am. We need smaller cultural centers around America where Jews could interact with Judaism in a way that isn't primarily rooted in just religious and theology, but that Jews could explore their creativity and full potential in the diaspora. And he called his movement the JCC movement. And the JCC movement goes on to then, of course, impact the entire American Jewish life, right? Anybody who's ever been to a Jewish summer camp, anybody who's ever been to a Jewish youth program, anybody who, of course, has been to a JCC, right? All of these things, right, that began to proliferate in, right, Hillel, right, the organization I work for, right, can also be put under that, right, in the 1920s, right? This was all a result of Mordechai Kaplan's brainchild, right, which was a result of Ahad Ha'am's thinking, which was, we need to focus on a type of spiritual and cultural Jewish engagement that doesn't just worry about protection for Jews and also need not necessarily be rooted in theology. And so it's an entirely different model of not just Zionism, but as Judaism moving forward. And Ahad Ha'am turns out, right, a lot of times one of his nicknames would be the secular prophet. And what was really interesting is that Ahad Ha'am, of course, grew up, he grew up Hasidic. And for many years, people thought he might be a Hasidic rabbi. And so Ahad Ha'am, right, moves to Israel, and he's, of course, extremely spiritual, but no longer, right, theologically orthodox, but very rooted in traditional Judaism. And so there are stories that Ahad Ha'am Shabbat afternoon, right, traditionally in a lot of Jewish communities, but specifically the Hasidic communities, Shalosh Shudas, or the third meal right before sundown on Saturday afternoon, is considered a time of immense spirituality. And so in the Hasidic world today, right, communities will all gather around the Rebbe's table in the afternoon on Saturday, and they'll sing and they'll have drinks, and the Rebbe will share words of wisdom. And so there are stories about Ahad Ha'am in his house in Palestine, right, having all of these different followers ranging from religious to secular to atheist to traditional to Ashkenazi to Mizrahi, Jews sitting around his table while he on Shabbat afternoon would be smoking a cigar, which of course traditionally is against the rules of Shabbat, sharing words of Torah, right? So if you want to figure out, how interesting and conflicted of a character Ahad Ha'am was, right, that was him. But his vision for Zionism, right, not only challenges Herzl, I think continues to challenge diasporic Jewry today. And also we see how much of a positive effect to some extent, right? Because Jewish life in America is unfathomable without camps, youth groups, and JCCs and Hillels, right? 90% of what we talk about when we talk about Jewish life are these things. And this is all due, of course, to this incredibly astute thinker, Asher Ginsburg, Achad Ha'am, and to cultural Zionism. So happy to stay here. I think we have about 15 minutes left. If people have thoughts or questions.
So thank you, Daniel. I just want to say a couple things. First of all, the class actually goes technically till 10:30. Sometimes people go over. You could talk to us all day, and I think most of us would be really happy to just sit here and learn from you. So I'm happy, you'll leave the room open. And I want to say hi to my Temple Beth Tikva friends. I'm so happy you're here. And there are some people I don't recognize, EH and Army. I put you in the text, and Barbara. We just love to know how you found out about Advanced Learning Institute, just because we don't know who sort of connects to the collaborative and who doesn't. So if you're willing to share that with me in the chat, I'd appreciate knowing that. And Daniel, this essay, if you send it to Madalena, she can attach the full essay along with the recording of this class. And my other question to you is, are you pushing this to your Facebook? Or
I did, because we couldn't figure out how to attach it to the
Jewish Collaborative Facebook.
So I figured I just wanted it out there just so.
So can you lift it, and then is there a way to share that with our Facebook, or it's not? You just streamed it on your own thing, and that's fine. The recording doesn't matter. I think it doesn't.
Just streamed it on my own, but I think we can probably just share it.
You can share it specifically. If you just want to share it to the Jewish Collaborative Facebook, that's good. If you want to share it to your own feed and everybody in your friends group, that's all right too.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway, I'm gonna head out in a second, but of course we'll leave this open for questions for Daniel. Yeah, thank you. It was a great class.
Thank you. Well, I'm here if anybody has thoughts or questions or comments, or I'd love to hear what people think. And if no one has thoughts, then I will see you. Rosalie, go for it. See her.
Am I the only one that's never heard of this man? Or if I have, it's just, I blocked him out. I mean, I only hear about Herzl. Is it just me?
It's not you. What I will say, this might, we'll tackle this. Usually I wouldn't bring this up 14 minutes overtime, but if you're still here, then this is the, everyone here has already accepted overtime. There's a couple of reasons. He got a lot of flack, and just being totally honest, and Achad Ha'am is one of my favorite Jewish thinkers, so I'm about to insult him. So he got a lot of flack after the Holocaust. I mean, he had been dead for 25 years, but it turned out historically, I mean, while I think Achad Ha'am was right in a lot of his observations about Jewish communal life, he very much, especially later on in his life, was becoming increasingly critical of political Zionism and their dire methods of creating a state. And so over and over again, he wrote, anti-Semitism is getting better, right? The important thing is not creating a state, right? The important thing is this Jewish cultural center. It's not worth sacrificing the second to help the first. He was becoming increasingly critical of the disposition of political Zionists towards the Arabs and local population. And so, we can treat that however we want, but historically, once Israel was founded, he was somebody who, to some extent, right, he wasn't necessarily against statehood, but for him, statehood was a secondary concern. And so his history treated him very, very split, right? I think probably he doesn't get enough credit, because I do think he was responsible for much of both Israel and in America in terms of what we enjoy today. And it's also true that because of him and his followers, Israel might not have been founded as quick as it would have been if everybody was on board with political Zionism from the get-go, although I'm not sure. But I think in early Israel, especially after the Holocaust, and especially then with the 1948 war and 1967 war, and as you had these huge wars for Israel's survival, Achad Ha'am oftentimes brought a moral voice that a lot of people didn't want to hear. I will say, I think there has been a resurgence, especially among, I'll use the term liberal Zionists. Among liberal Zionists, Achad Ha'am becomes sort of a hero because he was a Zionist, of course. He believed very strongly that an Israel that was just focused on politics and materialism, and in another essay he says power, right, is going to be one that ultimately is going to be not something worth doing. And so he's oftentimes used in a lot of conversation today to implicitly critique current Israeli policy or Israeli government through Zionism, right? Obviously, if somebody's an anti-Zionist, right, they don't even need Achad Ha'am to do that, but oftentimes, right, you have that tension. So he definitely doesn't get as much credit as he deserves, and his legacy is also, in terms of his effect, obviously very, very split.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear about him today. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other thoughts here? I'll go for it, Sylvie. I also see 10 screens of just names. So if you have anything to say, you're also more than welcome to put it in the chat. Go for it, Sylvia.
Yeah, I'm thinking it's kind of maybe I heard this in a more superficial way. I don't know, but that what has been the tension, one of the big tensions in Israel for the last I don't know how long, is religious government and non-religious government, and how that impacts Jews' feeling of Zionism, and especially what's going on today, and the seemingly trying to get back to orthodoxy in the state, which kind of he talked about.
Yeah. So the one interesting